Welcome to the 2021 Little Lecture Series sponsored by the West Virginia Humanities Council. It's a real privilege to be starting out the lecture series this year. It's a special month for me because 20 years ago, this month, I got a call from a guy by the name of Ken Sullivan, who I'd never met, but I'd heard of before. And he wanted to know if I would be interested in working on a project called the West Virginia Encyclopedia. And I said yes. I was in between my master's and my doctoral work at WVU. I was going to start at WVU that fall. But he called me in March and asked me to come on board. And I've been working with the Humanities Council in one form or another, either encyclopedias or museum exhibits or committee work ever since. And so I think this not only is a series great, but it's really an honor to have had so much of my professional career intertwined with the council in what I think is one of the most important organizations in the state for promoting the humanities and for small museums. I know the Mine Wars Museum, of course, where I'm at, wouldn't be what it is without the support of organizations like the council. And we are thrilled, of course, to always have their support, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this series and to be a part of anything that's involved with the council because I just think it's a great organization. Now, when I sat down to wonder what I was going to talk about when they asked me to go over Blair Mountain, of course, I have a new book coming out that's out on Blair Mountain, but over the last 10 years, I've given dozens of talks, written many, many articles, been in a number of films. So I tried to think, what on earth could I possibly say about Blair Mountain that I haven't already said? What new angle can I take on it? And I'm not going to talk to you about the history of Blair Mountain because many of the people that are watching this, you've already are somewhat familiar with the history, some more so than others, but you know the general story. So we're not going to review the history here. And if you really want in-depth look at what we did to save the battlefield from mountaintop removal, you can read what I wrote about it. I want to talk about Blair Mountain as a place, as a sacred landscape, and its significance of the place itself, why it needs to be preserved. And we're going to look at some of the methods that we use to add layers of protection to the Blair Mountain battlefield. And when I say we, I'm talking about the group Friends of Blair Mountain, the group, the nonprofit that I served as president as, and I'm still on the board. Now, my first trips over the Blair Mountain battlefield was over Route 17 as a teenager on a school bus. I went to school in Lincoln County, a little single-A school called Duval High School. And we often played basketball and football games, with schools in Logan County, like Sharples or Sharpless, if you are in Logan County. And schools that you had to take Route 17, which was the route that the miners took in 1921, over the southern crest of Blair and on into some of these schools. We would go over this mountain, and of course, I was pretty much the only person on the bus that had any idea what we were going over. And, I was just becoming familiar with the history that was so closely connected to my family, so closely connected to my home. And I'd yet to fully grasp the significance of the place. Staring out the window as the bus wound the sharp curves around the southern crest, and if you've ever driven over it, you know that there's some really steep, sharp curves that go over Blair Mountain. I thought about what was happening there so many years before. I'd wondered, was there a coal miner standing behind this tree? Where was it that somebody was killed? Where were the shots coming from? Who bled there? Who died there? What brought them there? Now, at the time, no one seemed to know, and no one seemed to really care. To everyone else on the bus, it was just another mountain, on the way to just another ball game. But the Blair Mountain battlefield is one of America's sacred landscapes. Now, intuitively, I may have known this as a teenager riding the bus to a ball game, but I didn't tangibly comprehend the sacredness of Blair Mountain until I walked on its slope for the first time many years later. It's many years after I was riding over it as a teenager before I actually walked up on the slopes. And that was in December of 2010. On that day, it was in the morning, I accompanied Kenny King and two reporters from CNN, Rob Howell and Dave Timko. Now, a month before that, I had gone into Blair and met with Kenny King and Harvard Ayers and Brandon Ida and a few other activists. And we had decided that we were going to plan a protest march that would retrace the original steps of the march on Blair in 1921. And we were doing this to raise awareness and to build momentum to try to protect the Blair Mountain battlefield from destruction by mountaintop removal coal mining. That had happened just a month before. But I still hadn't been up in the woods on Blair. In the meantime, CNN had said that they were going to do an hour-long documentary on mountaintop removal. And they'd caught wind of our protest march. They had interviewed me, and they decided that they wanted to make me a main character in one of their stories because of my family connection to the mine wars. They wanted Kenny and I to go up on with them to Blair Mountain. And in between my classes, I had about a 2-hour break between my classes that semester. We went up one morning in December 2010, and it was a snowy morning. It had actually snowed about 3 inches that morning. And I left my class and got in the car, in Kenny's truck, and we went up to the southern crest of Blair. We went up on this mountain, and he took us to where there was a defensive entrenchment. And I still remember, you could hear the snow crunching under your feet as you're walking up along the ridge line. And I remember as we were nearing up the southern crest, we saw a buck and a doe staring at us, and they darted off down the slope. And they darted off down the direction from which the miners would have been coming. And it was the first time I'd ever really just looked down the slope. And it was in that moment that I first began to really set in on me the gravity of where I was standing, of what I was seeing. Until you're there, until you can look down and wonder what it is that would have drove men to go up this really, really steep hillside. What would have driven them to risk everything? People that are untrained, people that weren't military men. There were a few war veterans that were on the march and that fought in the Battle of Blair Mountain, but most of them were not. What would drive a person to do this? But you don't really understand the magnitude of the risk that they're taking until you can stand there and look down the slope and see the deer going down and understand this would have been a suicide charge if you would have just done a full frontal assault. When Kenny led us up to where there was an entrenchment, I stood behind where the entrenchment was while the CNN folks interviewed Kenny, and I was looking around, and it really began to set in onto me that I was standing on sacred ground. And I knew then that I had to do everything that I could, and we had to do everything that we could to make sure that this place stays protected. If you grew up in West Virginia, you've heard many times, rifle shots in the forest. It's a common sound during hunting season, right? You just hear rifle shots up in the forest. And I was sitting there on this entrenchment looking down the slope where somebody was defending the slope of Blair Mountain, somebody from Don Chafin's army. And I wondered, did they kill anybody? Did they hit anyone? Were they themselves hit or killed? What were they thinking? What was going through their mind? And I could almost hear the gunshots of 1921. I could almost feel the bullets whizzing by me. And I have no idea what on earth I told the CNN people. Luckily, whatever I said didn't make the final cut of the documentary, so it must not have been that profound. But nonetheless, I can't escape what that moment made me feel. Since I had learned that the battlefield had been removed from the National Register of Historic Places in 2009, I felt the need to make a stand. But it was until that December morning I didn't fully grasp that I stood on sacred ground. Books and films can tell the story of the mine wars, but one must experience the places. Rub your hands across the bullet holes on the brick buildings in Mate 1. Walk along where the train tracks were beside the Holly Grove tent colony on Paint Creek. See the slopes of Blair Mountain and look at the entrenchments. That's what you have to do to really get it. You have to see it. You have to feel it. You have to touch it. You have to have that experience of place in order to really grasp the gravity of what was happening. And I knew then that protecting the place, the landscape, was imperative to keeping the history alive. Losing was not an option for me, and it was not an option for the people who joined up with our fight. Over the course of the next 8 years, we would have our protest march, but we would do many other things to protect the Blair Mountain battlefield and get it relisted, successfully relisted on the National Register of Historic Places and protected from mountaintop removal. We formed coalitions. We formed coalitions with groups like the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the United Mine Workers, the Sierra Club, local groups like the Ohio Valley Environmental Coalition, the West Virginia Labor History Association, and many others. We went to court, federal court, state court, but we also became citizen regulators. We conducted site inspections. We did reconnaissance. We kept an eye on what was going on. We sought to negotiate. And we also sought to use this as an opportunity to reclaim our true regional historic identity and change the public narrative. And I think that we've been successful in doing that. 11 years ago, if I was in Charleston and I was talking to somebody and I mentioned Blair Mountain, they would say, "What? Huh?" Now if you say Blair Mountain, everybody knows. And it's because of those efforts that we and other folks have made, it's reinserted it into not just the regional consciousness, but the national consciousness. To think about Blair Mountain and to think about the many things that we did to protect it, and obviously in a little lecture, we don't have time to go into all the details and all of the things that we have, but I want to focus a little bit on the archaeology. Not just the archaeology that was done, but our battle to use archeological surveys as a means of protection and to magnify how significant the place itself was. One of the times before we went before the West Virginia Surface Mine Board, we went before the West Virginia Surface Mine Board twice and secured gains, preservation gains in both of those situations, which is not an easy thing to do. And the first time we did it, I testified both times, but the first time, I talked about the Battle of Gettysburg. If you're studying the Battle of Gettysburg, you can rely on a lot of different sources. You can look at generals' letters, you can look at diaries, you can look at letters from troops. You can do all of these things, find all these primary documents in order to learn about the battle. But you don't have that at Blair Mountain. The miners kept to a code of silence. They were, after all, committing what some would call treason. And so they didn't talk about it. Many of them went to their graves not talking about it. Getting my own family to talk about it was like pulling teeth at times when I was a younger man. It was very difficult to get people to talk about it. I've spoken with David Allen Corbin, the author of Life, Work, and Rebellion in the Coalfields. And Corbin wrote the first full academic study of the mine wars. And he had just tremendous amounts of trouble getting people just to talk to him about it because of this code of silence. It didn't just go for that generation. Even though the stories were passed down from generation to generation, people kept it within their families. I've often said that Blair Mountain is kind of like West Virginia's table talk. When I was a kid growing up and we would eat dinner together, every now and then my mom or my dad would say, "Now, what I'm about to tell you is table talk." We always liked hearing table talk. We liked hearing it because whenever you heard that there was table talk, you knew you were going to get some good scoop. You knew you were going to get some good gossip. Somebody's getting divorced, so something's going on in the community. But table talk meant that it stayed at the table. You didn't go anywhere else. Once you heard this information, it doesn't leave the table. And that was kind of like the history of the mine wars. It was passed down from generation to generation, but people didn't talk about it openly. It was kind of a secret for a lot of reasons, something that swept under the rug. Because you don't have this paper trail, because you have this code of silence, you have to have the landscape in order to tell the story. You have to have the archaeology. You have to have people that are going to go and find where people were standing by digging up bullet shell casings and finding out what caliber of weapons they were using. We have to find out where the troops were moving, where the defensive emplacements were. You have to understand all of these things so that you can use that to reconstruct what actually happened, because we don't have primary documents from the people that were fighting. So for the above reasons, one of the key fronts in our battle to save the mountain and the battlefield itself involved requiring a thorough archaeological survey of the battlefield before any kind of surface disturbances could occur. This would add a layer of protection not afforded us due to the fact that the battlefield had been delisted from the National Register in 2009. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole process of it getting delisted. You can read my book if you want to know all those details. But it gets delisted unjustly, as a federal court would rule in 2016. But to date, there's never been a full archaeological survey of the battlefield. Now, in 2006, and again in 2009, Harvard Ayers, an archaeologist from Appalachian State University, he conducted a partial survey of some areas around Blair and also Crooked Creek Gap up in that area. And his groundbreaking study was essential to getting the battlefield listed on the National Register. And then Harvard would go back and do some more work. Archaeologist Brandon Nida would also do work. Kenny King, of course, is not a professional archaeologist, but he's been going up there for 30 years with a metal detector, finding things and looking things and charting things out. Nonetheless, in all of that work that's been done, there's well over 80% of the battlefield that's never been studied by a professional archaeologist. And you have to understand that the Battle of Blair Mountain, it's called the Battle of Blair Mountain, and people said save Blair Mountain whenever we were on the protest march. But the battle itself is much larger than Blair Mountain. It starts at Blair Mountain in the south, and then it kind of follows ridge lines, Spruce Fork Ridge, and then up to Crooked Creek and on up to Mill Creek. And so it's almost 12 miles of ridge line that encompasses the entire battlefield. It's extremely steep, it's rugged, heavily forested area, it's inaccessible. Many parts of the battlefield are not accessible by any kind of public road. You have to do, in some cases, park your car and then hike for a while before you even get to the battlefield. So most of it had never been studied. Most of it was still a mystery. So we wanted to make sure that it had to be studied before you could touch it. The coal industry, meanwhile, worked diligently to sidestep any responsibility for locating potential historic sites and artifacts. And holding the industry accountable became paramount to our success. Now, between 2012 and 2014, we met numerous times with coal executives and state leaders in an attempt to reach a compromise on the battlefield. What they eventually agreed to do, the industry agreed to abide by the Section 106 review process of the National Historic Preservation Act. Now, let me get into some, really mundane details here, but it's something that you need to understand. So, if a site is eligible for listing on the National Register, it can be eligible for what's called a Section 106 review. So what this does, it requires regulatory agencies to consider the impacts of any development projects, such as mining, but it can be other projects from construction or timbering or whatever, on properties eligible for listing on the National Register. So what happens is the State Historic Preservation Office is supposed to work with companies, other regulatory agencies. In this case, it would be the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, the Army Corps of Engineers, and also with other groups with a vested interest in the property to assess any adverse impacts that a project may have and work to mitigate damages. That's a Section 106 review. And at times, this mitigation takes the form of what they call a programmatic agreement. And this is where companies agree to meet certain terms before the development project begins, such as mining or whatever. So in July 2014, the coal companies produced a programmatic agreement. They mailed me a copy, they mailed Kenny King a copy, and some other groups. I was on vacation at the time, actually, when it was mailed. I was in South Carolina fishing when I got a call from Kenny King, and Kenny was not happy. He had already read through the programmatic agreement. In fact, Kenny began immediately referring to it as the problematic agreement. Aside from the fact that the companies only agreed to preserve 8.5 acres on Blair Mountain after blasting. This is a site that is 1,269 acres. They promised to preserve 8.5. They also claimed that they had already hired a private company to conduct cultural resource surveys on the battlefield acreage, and that no sites of historic significance had been found. The companies argued that these cultural resource surveys were sufficient means of studying the battlefield and that no archaeological studies were needed to be conducted. The programmatic agreement also stipulated that once all the regulatory agencies signed this agreement, that those agencies waived all rights to any other regulation or any other inspection of the properties. According to the report, and I'm going to be quoting directly from the report, according to the report, the objective was to present, quote, the results of an architectural survey, including the systematic mapping of all buildings, structures, and objects 50 years of age and older, end quote. The study went on to state that criteria, back to the quote here, typically used to access archaeological sites was not applied to this project. So in short, the companies hired a private research firm to examine a rural, mountainous battlefield by having them search for historic buildings in the woods. When unsurprisingly they found no buildings, they reported at the end that there were no sites of historic significance on the battlefield and the coal companies could proceed with blasting. One does not go looking for architectural sites on a forested battlefield. One looks for signs of troop movements, buried weapons, shell casings, entrenchments, foxholes, buried objects, and even potential human remains. There's rumors that miners may have buried some of their dead on the battlefield. Now, I've never seen full evidence to substantiate that, but we know that sometimes miners buried their own dead in other incidents, such as the 3 days Battle of the Tug, which took place a few months earlier. Frank Keeney had said the same thing. So we don't know, and of course we'll never know unless we have a full archaeological survey of the entire battlefield. But it's one of the possibilities. So we needed to demonstrate that this programmatic agreement and these cultural resource surveys as submitted by the coal industry were insufficient as any kind of means of mitigation. But how are we going to do that? Now, I wrote up an extensive amount of comments, about 10 pages single space, that I sent, I think it was 12 pages single space actually, that I sent to the different regulatory agencies, breaking apart this cultural resource survey and showing why that whenever you are looking at a battlefield, you don't go searching for buildings. But we had to find another way. And the way that we were going to do this is go back to the West Virginia Surface Mine Board. And we did that in September of 2014, just a couple of months after they issued the programmatic agreement. Let me talk to you for just a second about the Surface Mine Board, just explain to you what it is, okay? So this is within the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, West Virginia DEP. The Surface Mine Board hears legal appeals regarding mining permits and regulatory infractions. The board is comprised of 7 members, all appointed by the governor, and it has the authority to revoke permits, deny permits, and cite companies for breaking regulations. So we go before the West Virginia Surface Mine Board, and one of the things that we were arguing is that you had to have archaeological surveys, that what had been done was insufficient, and the Surface Mine Board needed to step in and do something about it. We argued some other things too in this, but this was a long hearing that we were involved in. You see, March 2014, just a few months back, Friends of Blair Mountain had conducted a citizen site inspection. This was under the supervision of OSMRE, the Office of Surface Mining Regulation and Enforcement, and West Virginia DEP had gone with us on a citizen site inspection. And we documented surface disturbances on the Camp Branch permit. There were 3 surface mining permits that threatened the Blair Mountain battlefield: the Atkins Fork permit, Bumbo number 2, and the Camp Branch permit. Well, we were doing a citizen site inspection on what's called Area B of Camp Branch. And we had we were able to document this because we were able to secure a local pilot who flew us over the battlefield, and Paul Corbett Brown, a professional photographer, who is a brilliant photographer, by the way. You should check out his website and his work, which is incredible. Anyway, he flew over the battlefield, and he was able to take pictures of places where there were recent disturbances. Particularly, there were places that had been clear-cut that went right into the battlefield. And there were areas that had been timbered that looked like it was a type of clear cutting that was a precursor to surface mining. Okay, they obviously have to cut down the trees before they begin blasting, so they did a clear cutting thing. And Keeney knew this area, which was where they specifically had defensive entrenchments that Keeney had documented himself many years before. We were able to secure a citizen site inspection to go on there and document where those surface disturbances were. So we went before the Surface Mine Board, and our issue was with those specific areas. What it revealed was that either excavators or bulldozers had destroyed defensive entrenchments and archaeological sites on the battlefield. And again, this was a small area, and this actually wasn't on Blair Mountain itself. This was actually a few miles northwest of Blair Mountain proper. Anyway, according to the conditions of the permit, the coal companies were supposed to survey the area for archaeological sites and preserve areas of historical significance. This was written into the permits. We secured copies of all these permits through the Freedom of Information Act, and we would not have been successful with the Freedom of Information Act. And these permits are documents that are all well over 100 pages each. These permits, coal mining permits, are actually complicated, and it's just a pleasure to read. And so what we were able to do is we knew that if we could find things where they cut corners, where they ignored certain regulations, that we could get them in a certain way. And that's what we found. We found that within the permit conditions itself, that they were supposed to do a survey to find potential archaeological sites, and they were to preserve those areas. If workers came upon a site in the process of their activities, companies were supposed to halt their operations until a professional could view the site. The Cultural Research Survey that was used by the company, of course, did not identify any sites because it was looking for buildings in the woods. So we went before the Surface Mine Board and we testified. I testified as an academic. Keeney testified as someone who's gone up there and documented the area himself. And Joe Stanley, another of our members, also testified as a former coal miner and as someone who'd worked on a surface mine site before and had understood the different equipment that was used there. We all testified. Basically, what we testified was that the coal company had destroyed these areas in places that we'd found on our citizen site inspection and that we knew had archaeological sites on it. And what Joe Stanley did in his testimony was he showed that the heavy equipment that you're operating in order to do this clear cutting, there's no way that you could identify foxholes. There's no way that you're going to be able to identify places where there might be bullet shell casings if you've got these big bulldozers that you're using. And as a result, some of these sites were destroyed when they clear-cut sections of the Camp Branch permit. Now, we went through this really long hearing, and ultimately the Surface Mine Board did not punish the industry for the sites that they destroyed. Well, that's one of the things we were asking for. But they did rule through our testimony that if the companies intended to mine in the future, that additional archaeological surveys would be appropriate before they did any operations. This was a big victory for us because that's another layer of protection for the battlefield. It also nullified the whole programmatic agreement because the programmatic agreement stated that what they had previously done was sufficient. Now we had the West Virginia Surface Mine Board saying that no, those cultural resource surveys were not sufficient, that they had to do more. This would make it more costly and more time-consuming for the companies if they wanted to proceed. A quote I gave to the other Friends of Blair Mountain members often, it's a Muhammad Ali quote. He said, it's not the mountain to climb that wears you down, it's the pebble in your shoe. And said, we're the pebble in their shoe. And we're going to wear them down in this way. And that's what we did. It added a layer of protection, made it more expensive, more costly. It's just another hoop that they're going to have to jump through before they can even begin mining. A way in which we can help protect the battlefield while it was in federal court litigating whether or not it would be relisted. We found this is a much more appropriate and effective way of slowing the industry down as opposed to simply protesting or holding up a sign. As I've said many times before, anybody can hold up a sign that says Save Blair Mountain, but you have to have the patience and the wherewithal and the tenacity to go through mountains and mountains of documents, find the specific ways in which you can legally use protections, and find a way to make the system bend towards your advantage. We were able to do this. And of course, in 2016, we won the federal lawsuit. Judge Reggie Walton, that ruled in our favor, remanded the delisting decision back to the keeper of the National Register. And in the summer of 2018, Blair Mountain was placed back on the National Register of Historic Places. According to West Virginia State Code, you cannot use surface mining on any property that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And the battlefield is now protected from mountaintop removal mining. It should not have been this difficult. There are many battlefields in America, from Wounded Knee, Washita, Little Bighorn, Gettysburg, Cowpens, Princeton, across numerous wars, everything from the War of 1812 to the French and Indian War to the Native American removal. And many of these places are under threats from various types of mining, development. Even Gettysburg, portions of the Gettysburg battlefield are now threatened with housing developments. And so even Gettysburg isn't immune to these kinds of things. There's a quote from Vine Deloria, a Lakota scholar. Every society needs sacred places. A society that cannot remember its past and honor it is in peril of losing its soul. For me, the battle for Blair Mountain was the battle for the soul of West Virginia. It's a battle about who we are, who we've been, but also the fate of the place itself as an indicator of where we are going. If we can't preserve these sites, then we can't learn from them. I believe battlefields are sacred ground for many reasons. They're landscapes of conflict, sacrifice, heroism, tragedy, and bloodshed. Places like Blair Mountain tell us stories of clashing ideals, class divisions, racial hierarchies, nationalism, conquest, and resistance to conquest. To stand on a battlefield is to be haunted by all these ghosts at once. One is forced to try and make sense of them. One cannot escape the past on a battlefield. And as places of war, battlefields bring the conflicts of the past to life, from the glorious to the shameful, and everything in between. On these landscapes, people fought, killed, and died for reasons both just and unjust. We cannot know who we are as a society unless we hold on to these places and seek out the harsh lessons of the bloodied soils of North America. And Blair Mountain is paramount to all of that. Thank you for listening to this little lecture. And if you want to know more, of course, you can look at my book on Saving Blair Mountain, The Road to Blair Mountain, or come visit us at the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. Should also mention that there's going to be a weekend of celebration for the 100th anniversary over Labor Day weekend. Check out the website Blair 100 and look at all those activities. But I believe now is the moment to open things up for questions. I want to once again thank Eric and the great staff of the Humanities Council for putting up with me yet again. It's really not. It's just something that we were just, we were looking for layers of protection that we made it easier to preserve the battlefield. So it's not really a technical term. I'm not a preservation historian per se, and so I was learning all this as I went. And so we were able to find little ways, like ways of getting the Surface Mine Board to say, you have to do an archaeological survey. What you've done before is not adequate. Did that save Blair Mountain? No, but it made it that little bit more difficult for them to proceed. So it's those kinds of things that I referred to as preservation gains. One of the things that we tried to do is to show, first of all, that one of the big arguments for destroying the battlefield itself was that you needed to create jobs. So we put forth the argument, if you made it into a park, then these are permanent jobs that you're creating, not temporary jobs. There's an economically viable argument. You can make money off this property without blasting it. You can turn it into something that's beneficial to you and beneficial in the long term for the community. In fact, the permits showed that maximum, if they were able to do all the blasting that they wanted to do, the mining would all be done in less than 8 years. And so we're talking about a maximum of 8 years worth of employment. So we go to these executives and say, you're only going to make money from this for a specified amount of time. If you took it and developed it, you could make money off of it for an indefinite amount of time. So there's ways in which you can try to talk their language, so to speak, because sentimentality obviously isn't going to get you very far with certain interests. And therefore you have to know how to say that this can benefit you, this can go into your interests as well. That's one of the ways in which we tried it. And we tried this with varying levels of success. First of all, from an educational standpoint, it gets students out of the classroom, and they learn better when they're outside of a classroom sometimes, particularly with history. And history, when you're looking at it through a book, particularly from a student's perspective, it can seem abstract, almost like it's not real. It's just a story that you're reading in a book. The place makes it real. That's where, as an educational tool, it's so much more valuable. Now, this isn't connected to the battlefield itself, but at the Mountain Wars Museum, one of the artifacts, one of my favorite artifacts, is one piece of script that we have that says, good for one piece of bread. That's just what it says. It's a very unique, I've only found a couple of pieces of script that specify what kind of item that you can buy. And if you're holding that in your hand, it says, good for one loaf of bread, and you see that will say more as a teaching tool than anything that I can say in a long, boring lecture. Because then you can begin to understand, that's why they went on strike. That's why they were willing to live in tents, because somebody was giving them a coin that said good for one loaf of bread. So it's that when you can feel it, when you can touch it, it makes it more real. And if you're at Gettysburg, it's kind of a walking thing. If you think about it, if you're walking across that field where Pickett's charge took place, and you can more easily put yourself in the shoes. You're walking this full distance while cannon shells are going off around you, and you can see they lost 2/3 of their men. That charge when you go there. And I don't want to get mystical about it or overly sentimental about it, but you can almost feel the ghosts of the past when you're in an old place. There's something to the feel of it. We're in a historic house right now, where there's a Civil War cannonball that's on display here. And it gives it this added flavor, knowing the stories that happened here, knowing, all the things that these walls have seen. It gives you, I think, an extra magnitude. When you're talking about the actual Battle of Blair Mountain, of course you have the newspaper clippings, but of course that a lot of that has to be taken with a grain of salt. A lot of the journalists couldn't even get to the fighting, so they had to rely on reports. Other guys like Boyd and Sparks, he made it to Blair Mountain, and then a Logan mine guard shot him in the leg and took him prisoner. And when he tried to write a story, there was a mine guard there editing as he was going. And Sparks later recalled that the mine guard said, no sob stuff for the rednecks. As he was doing it. So you have to take all the reporting with a grain of salt. They didn't quite have a perfect ability to tell the story with some kind of accuracy, and that's if they didn't have an agenda going into it, as many of them did. On top of that, I have located some primary documents from the defensive end, from Chafin's end. And I found them recently, within the last year, the Logan County Coal Operators Association collection at the State Archives. I had only looked at the collection once. It's only been organized in recent years, so it's more recently put into the State Archives. And I was going through it with Kinsey New, our museum director, and I found a number of reports that people were making to Colonel Eubanks, who was evidently coordinating the defensive things. And you had some firsthand reports from the pilots who were giving reports on troop movements and little things like, we're over here near Crooked Creek. We may need you to send some more people by the morning. It looks like miners are massing here, some little reports like that. And to my knowledge, that is the only thing I've ever found that gives a first-hand account of some of the fighting that was taking place. And as far as things like the organization of the march itself, there's only one piece of paper that deals with the organization of the march, and that was a letter from Harold Houston, the UMWA attorney, to the UMWA local in Blair. This was 2 weeks before the miners started to even gather at Marmette. It was the day after they had the Capitol rally, in which Frank Keeney said the only way you can get your rights is with the high-powered rifle. He said, then go home and await the call to march. The next day, a letter came out of Harold Houston's office to the guys in Blair saying, miners are going to be coming. We're sending guns ahead of time. And it says at the bottom, burn after reading. But one of Bill Blizzard's grandchildren found that letter folded up in a book in an attic many, many years later. And that one piece of paper is the only thing that directly ties the Union leadership to the organization of the march. So, as far as primary documents, there's not much there. That's why, reconstructing it through archaeology is paramount. It does fit in directly. I just didn't have time to explain it all in a little lecture. In fact, with the permits, and Billy Joe Payton was involved, and Mike Workman were involved in that in 1991. And the industry itself was using that survey on one of their permits and saying that that survey didn't find any archaeological sites. Therefore, there's nothing up there. I had to call Billy Joe up when I got a copy of the report, and I called him up before he went before the Surface Mine Board, and I said, do you realize that these permits say this? And they mentioned him by name, Billy Joe Payton by name. The work Billy Joe Payton did, he didn't find anything. And Billy Joe said, I spent 2 days on the Blair Mountain battlefield with Kenny King in 1991 and went over, 5% of the battlefield. We weren't even looking for archaeological sites. We were just walking around the woods, and he was showing us stuff, right? And so I had Billy Joe write up a letter stating that the survey that they did in 1991 was in no way, shape, or form meant to identify archaeological sites, and the company should not use them as a means of mitigation. And he wrote up the letter, signed it, gave it to me the day before the hearing, and then he emailed copies of it to the Surface Mine Board and the higher-ups at West Virginia DEP. And there was about an hour-long argument in the hearing on whether or not that letter could be admitted as evidence, because they were protesting that it couldn't be admitted as evidence, and they were saying that I forged the letter. And I was, offering to call Billy Joe up on my cell phone and put him up to the microphone. He was teaching at the time. But ultimately, it did get inserted into the record that it was not an adequate means of finding archaeological sites. But they fought us very, very much on that. This was in 2012. I wrote up a 10-page park proposal about all the things that should be there. Also, what should be in the town of Blair itself. Talked about it like a living history coal town in Blair. It's kind of on the model of colonial Williamsburg, something a bit of much smaller scale, like walking trails, because there are existing trails up on the Blair Mountain battlefield. And so you could have walking trails where those trails existed and not disturb the site itself. And various other things. I talked about a museum and also places for things that would have like art galleries, historic archives. It's really fascinating because a lot of the things that I had put in that plan in 2012 ended up kind of organically happening in Matewan, just not in Blair. Our museum has expanded out to have, we've got like a space for art gallery. We do lots of other events there that are beyond just, the exhibits themselves. So many of the things that I was hoping that would happen in Blair are now happening in Matewan.